know what legacy means.
It's what you pass down to your children and your children's children. It's what remains of you when you're gone.
This is the Legacy of Westeros, and you're tuning in to House of the Empire. I'm Zach, and I'm here with a couple of really big Game of Thrones fanatics, probably bigger than myself, if I'm being quite honest. Like, I'm a pretty big fan, but I'm anchored by a couple of dudes who are going to provide some really, really great insights on some really big developments that are going to be happening in the world of Westeros, and we're going to try to cover it all for you as much as we can with as much time allows. So I'm not going to dither about too much. Sean, Ryan, it suffice to say, we've got some really, really interesting stuff on the horizon, and in some cases, it's happening a little bit sooner than expected.
Yeah, to me, that's good news as long as they're not rushing anything along. And we'll dive into what the topic is shortly. But hey, I think there's a lot of honestly good news. Even the Jon Snow thing we're going to talk about, I think that's for the good, not the bad. And sometimes we just got to be a little patient.
Yeah, we're talking about Jon Snow. We're talking House of the Dragon. We're talking Aegon. We're talking just about as many different parts of the world of Westeros as we can possibly cover. Ryan, is there anything in particular about this evening's topics that you are particularly excited to cover?
Well, I think just in general, the part that really excites me is that, in typical Game of Thrones style, is they have a knack for making you wait and crave and want more. And now all of a sudden, I just feel like we've just been bombarded with news drops that says, okay, we got new releases, we got new shows, we got everything coming at you hot and heavy, and now all of a sudden we've been patiently waiting, and now they're like, okay, your patience is about to be rewarded with a whole lot of material. So I'm super excited about that.
Yeah, unless y'all have any objections, we're going to go ahead and dive right in because there's a lot to cover. And as I mentioned, just a little bit of time, a wee bit of time to actually get it taken cover. This came out about a week or two ago as of when we record, but it's still very much worth covering. HBO actively heating up the development of a Game of Thrones spin-off that is going to be all about Aegon's conquest. What's interesting to me, guys, is we started with the original Game of Thrones, the storyline from A Song of Ice and Fire, and then we get a storyline surrounding Fire and Blood, which was a prequel, what came before that. And now we're getting something that they're calling a spin-off, but is probably, in my eyes, technically another prequel to the prequel. Ryan, are we just going to keep going back and forth to the Long Night, or is there some point where we're actually going to skip ahead?
Well, I feel like, they've really dived into and focused in on, obviously the original, Targaryen household here. And it's just, I'm excited about it. I think Aegon's story is, really exciting, and I want to hear and read and see all as much as I can. I guess my biggest question is, why didn't we start here? That's maybe the topic point. But even though we talked, House of the Dragon has been spectacular. But now that we know Aegon seems to be coming into play, it just seems like we should have started with him in the first place.
Sean, you and I are big time fans of the dynamic between Tywin Lannister and Arya Stark from the original series. And I'm sure that we're not the only ones that feel that way. But the banter that went on between those two included an oral history of Aegon's conquest and how it's seen through the eyes of Arya and how it's perceived through the eyes of Tywin. Now we actually get to see some of that banter and some of that chemistry come to life in the form of those stories that they shared. Legend is becoming real. It's coming to the screen now. How do you feel about that?
It's an interesting development because if you go back a year prior, they talked about doing this, but as a cinematic movie. something that would release in theaters. Obviously, they altered that to attempt a TV series at it. Now we don't know if that's going to be a limited series, a full blown series, or something like A Night of the Seven Kingdoms, which is only intended to run, I believe, 2 seasons. But to me, prequels are hard because Ryan mentioned, why didn't we start here? Well, much like Star Wars or Lord of the Rings, you get to hear about these stories, and sometimes you get a vision in your head of what they might look and sound and feel like.
Right.
And you're playing with fire when you do that, because then you end up delivering it, and hey, it might not line up with what people have envisioned. That being said, I don't know if House of the Dragon necessarily lined up with what people had envisioned. And it blew me out of the water. Like, season 1 is not shaped at all like Game of Thrones. It's a fast paced, moving story across many years. Now we know into season 2 and forward, it will feel more like Game of Thrones. But the whole prospect of seeing Aegon the Conqueror, someone who's been talked about over so many different episodes of multiple series now in Westeros. You're building up an expectation. I don't want to say it's Anakin Skywalker, but like, I think the comparison is valid to go, hey, you built up Anakin Skywalker and young Obi-Wan Kenobi over in Star Wars for many years before we ever seen the prequels. Well, guess what? Aegon the Conqueror has been built up across so many different stories in Westeros, specifically Game of Thrones and House of the Dragon, that there is going to be an expectation level there. I do want to throw you this question, Zach, and Ryan for that matter. One of the events we've heard about so many times is the Doom of Valyria, which obviously happens before Aegon the Conqueror. And yet I can't think of a better time to maybe do that. Maybe the series starts with maybe not the full-blown Doom of Valyria, but like a little 10-minute sequence that touches on those events. I'd be pretty shocked if they don't do that in this. Do you think that they might deliver that?
If I'm being honest, no. I think you're right. The opportunity is there. But I also think that it would be a disservice to something as legendary as the Doom of Old Valyria to only haphazardly mention it in an introduction. We saw that type of situation, I believe, in, I want to say, Man of Steel, was it? Where we see Krypton only for a moment before they send Clark over to Earth, and then they try to fill it in. Like, I know it's not the same producers, but like not long after Man of Steel, somebody tried to jump on that legend and do a whole series about Krypton. I think it was on the CW, and it didn't last very long. And so I guess what I'm worried about is that there will be like a big production value. There will be a lot of, lot of just a little bit. And then when the time comes to actually show the Doom in its entirety, people predicting it, the very beginnings of it, the full blown Doom as it's happening, the death of people that you were getting slightly attached to, like all of that all encompassing Doom might not feel as impactful because of the little 10-minute sequence that we get in something else. So if they're going to do it, I want them to do it. I don't want them to half-ass it.
Yeah, and I agree with that. I think, even talking about the Aegon the Conqueror shows, like, what are we actually getting? Is it going to be a full series? Is it going to be one season, 2 seasons? Are we getting a mini series, right? I think those discussion points are still to be told because the story itself is not super long. And I think, when you talk about the Doom, it's the very similar concept. Like, obviously, the story and the impact of that story is super crucial to the history of Westeros. But it deserves more than 10 minutes. But does it deserve a full show? Maybe they could do something along the lines of what they originally talked about with Aegon and make it a movie or something. But it deserves more than 10 minutes of like a, oh, hey, this is what led to this story. It deserves more than that.
The visuals would be spectacular on the big screen if they could pull that off.
Yeah, it would. It would. I think it's also worth mentioning that this is, like you said, not just something that has been mentioned in one series, but Paddy Considine's character talks about the dream that Aegon has, and it's a big part of Viserys's character. And one of the last things that he mentions in season 1 of House of the Dragon. And so I think too that not only should there be something that covers the doom, but that doom should also be incorporated into the vision, and maybe even have flash forwards that are characteristically flashbacks for us as viewers of the Night King or something like that, where you tie Aegon's visions and dreams into the lore of Viserys's storytelling, and as a very real threat that was predicted centuries prior in a show that we've already seen. So I think if we're really going to get anything that's special and meaningful out of the Aegon show, I think that's what I would really want to see. I would want to see his dream of ice and fire and have it be flash forwards that are actually sequences of the Night King that we see in Game of Thrones. I think that would be what ties the series together really well.
For sure, there'd be something similar to what we got at the end of the pilot of House of the Dragon, where the way it was handled, even if you knew some of it, it was still shock and awe in the way that it was handled and tied directly to Game of Thrones. I think the thing that I'd be most excited to see with this series, guys, is simply he only takes over 6 kingdoms, not 7. So what the hell did Dorne do? That I find intriguing.
Well, to that point, that's actually, as I've thought about this today and just really kind of dove into where this is going, is what I actually want to see in terms of story. And Zach, I really do agree that I think, from Aegon's perspective, how his dream, how his vision kind of led him to, cross the sea and start to conquer the 7 kingdoms. But I want to see from the other side of the perspective of, what were the feelings of the people within the 7 kingdoms, as they kind of prepared for Aegon's impending his conquest, right? How did they think they could defend? How would they prepare? Did they have impending doom of what was coming to them? I'd love to see the perspective of those, each of the kingdoms, as well as Dorne, as how did they hold off, Aegon? That would have been really exciting.
There's definitely a lot of potential in this series, and I think what would make it so dynamic is the notion that everybody would believe themselves to be in the right. Aegon believes that he is in the right by unifying the kingdoms in preparation for the vision that he saw. Dorne believes themselves to be in the right because they are defending their homeland from invaders. The other 6 kingdoms believe themselves to be on a righteous endeavor of resistance because they value their independence. And so it'll be one of those almost like a Loki anti-hero type situations where, yes, he's conquering Earth, but he believes he is right and justified in doing so. I could definitely see Aegon to Loki parallels if they created his character in that type of dynamic anti-hero sort of way.
Yeah, I think they have a lot of opportunities to build up who, obviously the lore of Aegon is I think one of the most exciting aspects, and you've already touched on the stories and what that brings to the picture. So from the multiple points of view, how it's looked upon, and is he really the hero? Because honestly, at the end of the day, every villain thinks they're righteous, and every villain thinks that what they're doing is for the greater good, when in theory, it's actually just mass slaughter. So, right. I think, sure, we can build him up as an anti-hero, but at the same token, is he just murdering a bunch of people because he can?
Yeah. Yeah, I think there's both sides of that pendulum, and I think it's worth noting that in that article that we were showing you all, that it was just being discussed. Like, this is a show that has very, very much potential, but it has not officially been greenlit as of the writing of that article. So there's definitely a lot of stuff in the works at HBO, and this is right now one of the leading things that is probably just on the cusp of being announced.
Yep, it's in writing, and Matt, I forget his last name, but fella that did the Batman with Matt Reeves and is taking a bigger role with the sequel to that movie, is working hand in hand with George R. R. Martin. It seems like that's where George R. R. Martin's attention is right now, is on that series, much to the chagrin of people waiting on the Winds of Winter.
On the new book, yeah, we've been waiting for a while. I've got thoughts on that, but probably best safe for another time. One of the things that's really impactful to Game of Thrones fans in the here and the now is the recent announcement by David Zaslav that we are getting House of the Dragon sooner than we originally anticipated. We were originally predicting on this channel that it would be somewhere in the July to August area, and now Zaslav is saying that it's coming out next quarter, which means the latest we'll be getting the debut of season 2 will be in June. There's a lot of stuff that's coming out in this early part of the summertime. The Acolyte is supposed to come out early this summer. There's a few other, I want to call them dramedies that are coming out. I think The Bear season 3 is supposed to come out in June as well for the Hulu fans out there. There's a lot of really good content that's supposed to come out in this early summertime area. And so it's interesting to see that they are electing to move up the timeline a little bit, guys, in order to maybe compete with some of those other shows. I am on board with the idea of having new content a little bit sooner, but Ryan, do you think that it will be at the expense of production and quality to move it up this soon?
Well, that was, you kind of just led me right into where I was going with that. Yeah, I mean, of course, like, I mean, as a fan, I want it tomorrow. It's, from the perspective of how, I mean, it's been 2 years. We have been pushed, and we knew this was going to happen, but it's been 2 years, and I really want to see this show. But I also want to make sure it's done right. And I want to make sure that the production's good. I want to make sure it's been edited correctly. We're only getting 8 episodes, right? So, you have fewer opportunities to get it right. And I don't want it to be pushed or rushed to a point where, of course, it's going to be very high quality. There's no question on that. But I don't want Starbucks cups popping up in my scenes either. So I think it's really important that we focus on the quality more than the quantity and even the speed. So if it comes out in June and it's ready to roll, great. I'm excited for it. I just hope they don't rush themselves and put themselves on an arbitrary timeline that they might not be able to achieve.
I honestly thought that when it was announced, what would I say? I think Matt Smith and I forget who the other cast member was. They came out and said, "Yeah, it's going to debut in August." I thought, well, that's kind of weird considering when they started production, the fact they weren't hampered by the strike and that there's less episodes. And I always thought, okay, this thing should probably be out earlier in 2024. I think we did a video on our Legacy of Westeros channel that said, hey, there's the potential for this thing to come out earlier. Interesting to note that the original plan for House of the Dragon Season 1 was to be a late July, early August release date. And then they moved it back to basically go up against Lord of the Rings and or Season 1. Well, here we go, not 1 week after we find out that The Acolyte is more than likely going to debut June the 5th and use the Phantom Menace re-release as a marketing tool for that series. Well, now we find out that House of the Dragon's being moved up from August to June. And in terms of who it's coming from, like the guy or hate the guy, there's plenty of reason to do both, really, especially the latter. It's not like it's coming from the production assistant of wherever or an actor that might just have, opened a schedule for promotion and isn't referring to the launch. It's coming from David Zaslav. So, that's about as ironclad as it's going to get. And I don't know if they're doing it to go up against The Acolyte. I'm sure there's other shows coming out at that time. But I think the show's probably ready. They've had more than enough time. They weren't hampered by the strike, and I'm not too worried about that. That being said, if it's not ready and you rush it, then you're fucking with the Game of Thrones quality in the way that they distribute their content about it being quality first.
Well, you bring up an interesting point because, when I've been reading about this, and, a lot of Lord of the Rings fans are very excited about this because it's not going to compete when they release later in the year, and I think late August or September. So, in terms of the world of fantasy, like, don't get me wrong, I'm Acolyte Star Wars. I know that's going to be a very big production. It's going to be very, very popular. But I feel like the battle is, Lord of the Rings versus Game of Thrones. So the fact that they've actually decided to go in a different direction and push away from that competition, I find a little surprising.
Well, I'm just on board for new content because I think Sean is hitting the nail on the head that they've been working on this for a couple of years, and it's time. It's just time. Looking ahead, we've got one of the best lineups in the history of HBO, he says. Next quarter, we'll have Hacks and House of the Dragon, followed by The Penguin and the new Dune series. And then in 2025, we'll kick off the new year with a new season of The White Lotus, followed by The Last of Us and Euphoria. So within the next 6 to 8 months, we're getting a lot of new and a lot of renewal on HBO as a whole. And I'm pretty excited. I watched The Last of Us. I've heard a lot of good things about The White Lotus and Euphoria. I'm really intrigued by The Penguin. So hopefully HBO has their timeline in order. It sounds like they do. And that will include House of the Dragon. And we'll be able to enjoy that and whatever other content pops up on the channel.
And those aren't the only things listed for 2025, but more on that little topic in a bit. But let me just say this: wasn't necessarily on the agenda, but Zaslav gets a lot of crap, and again, rightfully so. But HBO as a whole, they are the pinnacle of the small screen in terms of delivering the most cinematic quality, visually, storytelling wise, character development. There is no close second, in my opinion. You can throw out Disney Plus all you want and everything that they're doing with Star Wars and Marvel. You can throw out the Lord of the Rings series, and none of it has the level of success or sustainability that HBO products have, whether it's, I believe Sopranos was HBO, House of the Dragon, Game of Thrones, The Last of Us, Succession, and so much more has come across that network that it's just... it's wild to see what they're able to do. And again, I get the hate, but at the end of the day, it's hard to argue with the end product they deliver on a lot of these.
Well, it just means there's going to be more discussion fodder for us here on the channel. So be sure to hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, and do everything that you can to keep up with all the new content that we'll be publishing here, talking about new episodes, talking about new theories, talking about maybe some character deep dives. There's going to be all kinds of things to talk about whenever that new season comes out. And, we mentioned Aegon's Conquest, we mentioned House of the Dragon, but that's not the only content that's coming out. And I think one of the last topics that we're going to be touching on is a series that we have mentioned before here on the show. And Sean, you've got an update of sorts on what we can expect about that show. That I was saying we need something that moves us forward. A lot of this stuff has been stuff that comes before Game of Thrones. The one series that is set after is kind of dragging along, and maybe it's for a good reason, maybe it's not. But what's the latest you've heard on Jon Snow?
So Talking Thrones was discussing this, and they're pretty accurate with their Thrones and Westeros information. And the last thing that they said is still in active development, because there was rumors that it wasn't, but basically that they were going not necessarily back to square one, but they were going to take their time with this and not try to rush it. And one of the reasons is, look, whether it's any property that you like, name them all. When you're dealing with legacy characters, and they're coming back and you're doing either a prequel or a sequel, you are signing yourself up for a level of criticism that's not the same as characters that people aren't familiar with. Jon Snow's a big one. What happened with Daenerys at the end of that Game of Thrones is obviously going to. I mean, Kit Harington already said it's going to play a factor in terms of what Jon's going through. And I think more time away is probably a good thing. And then when you look at their slate, like House of the Dragon season 2, like I don't see them releasing more than one Throne show in a year. I don't. HBO is very, again, quality heavy. So you got season 2 of House of the Dragon this year. You have season 1 of another show we're about to talk about next year, which probably puts you at House of the Dragon season 3 the following year, which puts you at that show that we're going to discuss the year after. So, I think it's just on the back burner. I think they would have come out and said, "Hey, this is no longer happening." But I do think it's important to get it right. Like if this is going to be a show that focuses on Jon Snow and features characters like Tormund and perhaps Samwell and Davos and some others, which I think are all on the table, I think it's good. But I will say this: HBO, Warner Brothers Discovery, they're all about making money and doing the big thing. Would not surprise me at all with them now having, pushing it back a few years, it seems like, if this thing turns into a full-blown Game of Thrones sequel. That's kind of where I think it might go.
Here's another thought, and Ryan, I want to get your thoughts on it. You mentioned that HBO, Warner Brothers might not do 2 series in the same year. But I think there is also the distinct possibility, based on recent comments about the release of seasons 7 and 8 of Game of Thrones, those storylines, from what I've heard in certain interviews and certain commentaries from certain podcasts and whatnot, that it was originally meant to be a movie trilogy. They were going to try to make them cinematic feature releases and just couldn't fit them into what they were trying to fit them into, and they ended up having to make them into full-blown seasons. Ryan, do you see the Jon Snow storyline being condensed into possibly a movie trilogy so that those things can release in succession with some of the other series and we don't have to wait until something like 2027 or 2028 in order to view it?
Yeah, I think they need to do what's going to be best to maximize the content that they have. And Sean has kind of already dabbled in, the timelines that are in place. And also, don't forget Aegon season 1, which is probably 2026 as well. So you might be looking at Aegon season 1 as well as House of Dragons season 3 in 2026. That really does kind of hamper what we can do with Jon Snow. So I really do want. I just feel like there's a lot to be done with Jon Snow, and they've put a lot of time and effort in these prequels, and I want a lot of time and effort put into Jon Snow. What do you call it? Post-school? What is that called? But I would not be mad with the trilogy. I just think we deserve more than a trilogy's worth of content. So I personally would like to see them try to make a series out of it. But if the timelines just simply don't allow for it, I think they could put a lot of eggs in their basket and make a very good cinematic trilogy. And if that's the direction they choose to go in, I know they're going to maximize what they have and it would be fantastic. My personal preference would be a show, though.
I think everybody's preference would be a show, but Sean, do you see it as a logistical possibility at least, so that we're not getting overloaded with Game of Thrones on the HBO streamer?
I think it entirely depends on what the story is, what they have planned. If this is going to be, I think everybody just jumps to the conclusion, oh, Jon Snow sequel, so this thing could end up running 5, 6, 7 seasons again. Maybe it ends up being a Game of Thrones sequel, just, a follow-up or continuation even. However, if there's only, if we're going 10, 15 years in the future, depending on where Jon is in his life at that point, there's definitely a possibility where I could see them going out and filming it like Lord of the Rings was filmed, or filming it like The Hobbit was filmed, or Pirates 2 and 3, where it's back to back to back and you're getting 3-hour films. It's possible that the story that they want to tell can be condensed down into that, and that it is more of just Jon and Tormund and maybe a couple others, rather than revisiting Winterfell and King's Landing and all that. I think I think it's definitely possible. I just don't know if they're ever going to jump from the small screen to the big screen. It's just a really hard transition to make. Again, it's one thing when you, even for them, it's one thing when you start off on the big screen and then you have a spin-off series on the small screen. But when you're starting off on the small screen, it's a lot harder to get people to go pay their hard-earned money to see something on the big screen, even something Game of Thrones quality. There's so many examples of films not doing as good as other films in terms of series that go to the big screen. And one that comes to mind is The Walking Dead. Like the Rick show just debuted the other day. It was supposed to be a movie trilogy, and then it was just going to be one long movie, and then it ended up being however many episodes it is. I think it's 6.
Yeah.
So like I'm skeptical about the possibility of it being on the big screen, but you bet your ass I'd be there opening night to see it.
Oh, hell yeah.
Shoot it in IMAX too. Then I'll really be there.
Shoot it with the Apple Vision Pro cameras and have everybody come in and watch it on VR and just break their fucking necks trying to figure out where the next attack is coming from, or watch arrows shoot over their heads. But yeah, I think it's a possibility, but regardless of which format it comes out, I'm excited to see what comes next from Jon Snow and his counterparts.
Yeah, and I just for my wrap on this is that, Jon Snow, Kit Harington, he's the one that came to HBO and said, "Hey, I want to do this," right? And they're already in the writers' room. They've already started putting in a lot of time and effort into this, And if I think 2026 or even 2027 is reasonable, but I mean, if we're talking schedules get pushed out even beyond that, I think it goes back to what you're saying, Sean, about where Kit is in his life. That if it doesn't come sooner than later, I just think it's might not happen at all. Which I think that would be leaving a lot of meat on the bone. But I think there is a real risk that could happen if it gets starting to get pushed out too far. So I think they need to make a decision and do it if they are going to.
Yeah, we need an announcement. We need to hear about it. But what's interesting is we have gotten an update and we have gotten an announcement on the Hedge Knight series following Dunk and Egg, the Knight of the Seven Kingdoms. We're only going to touch on this one briefly because there's not a whole lot of newness to it. We should know about the Hedge Knight. We should know about the Knight of the Seven Kingdoms. We know that it's based on some short stories about Sir Duncan the Tall. But, the update is really just that the February 2024 earnings call the show in pre-production, and this is another Zaslav statement that the show is expected to premiere sometime in late 2025. So this is what you were alluding to earlier, Ryan, talking about, we're going to get something that could be doubling up with something else. And, Sean was talking about how we're staggering things from one to the next. And this is one of those things that we're likely going to be staggering and alternating with House of the Dragon. And then we've got to factor in Aegon in there somewhere. I think it's interesting that this is one of those shows that is looking at starting at a time of year that we really haven't seen much Game of Thrones try to start from. If I remember correctly, the original Game of Thrones series debuted, I want to say, in like April of 2011. I may be misquoting that. But if we're talking about late 2025, then we're probably talking about like American Thanksgiving or something like that, like mid-November. And that's just not really a timeline that we've seen from Game of Thrones yet. So that's the thing that stands out to me the most, more than the storyline, more than the earnings announcement or anything like that. It's that the first Game of Thrones show did come out in April of 2011, and then House of the Dragon came out in the summertime. So now we're looking at a show with a fall release. How do y'all feel like that's going to fare with a storyline that's as lesser known as something like Duncan the Tall?
For me, this screams we want Westeros content every single year, and this is a series that we can make much cheaper than the later seasons of Game of Thrones and specifically House of the Dragon. which makes me kind of go, I don't know how I'm going to feel. Like, this is not, you talk about all the different Westeros stories. Like, I'm going to watch it because I think they're going to put out high quality, and I think it'll be good storytelling and great acting. But I don't think the release date really matters. I think if you're a fan of Westeros material and you believe in the quality that they do, then I think it's still going to fare well. But in terms of interest in the story that they've chosen, I got to be honest, this is way down the list for me. So for me, I'm hoping to be pleasantly surprised by this series. But, you know, this screams, hey, we can do this on a cheap budget, so let's do it.
Yeah, to me, I don't think the release matters one bit. I mean, if you're interested in Game of Thrones, you're going to watch it whenever it comes out. If they choose to go in a fall 2025 timeframe, you know, you could really try to maximize the U.S. holidays, right? You know, that's a time when families are more inclined to, and I don't know if family friendly is the right word here, but I think you have high opportunities where people will be more willing and have more time to watch television. So if it's something that people aren't as familiar with, you might be able to drag in a few extra eyeballs because of the holidays. So I think there could be some strategic aspect to that. But I look at it more of, this is kind of like the indie release for Game of Thrones. That's, you know, we don't know a lot about these characters. It might be a little bit more grungy and rustic. You know, it could be an exciting kind of slightly different variation of Game of Thrones that could, you know, kind of give us a palate cleanser, I guess, from what we've grown accustomed to.
Well, that's really all I've got about the Hedge Knight series. That's the latest and greatest update we've got. But you know, the Hedge Knight, the Sworn Sword, and the Mystery Knight are the three novellas that it's based on. So if y'all want some reading material to be able to know exactly what is going on, there is source material to read from. And I think circling back to the Snow series, there isn't any source material to pull from there. And so a lot of the things that we are getting series of is stuff that can be alluded to or referenced or be directly sourced from something else. And eventually, if Martin doesn't publish anything new, then it's going to be independent content. And the quality may take a dip at that point, but we will have to cross that bridge when we get there. Ryan, any final thoughts before we close up this episode and call it a night?
I mean, I'm just excited. I mean, you know, I know we don't want to oversaturate ourselves with too much content because that can be a bad thing as well. But I think the direction that they've decided to go in, you know, and the fact that we finally got some new material coming not too far down the road is just super exciting. And then I just hope that leads into the next, and the next couple of years is exactly what we hope they would be as fans.
Sean, any final thoughts from you?
Yeah, you know, some people might roll their eyes at this, but the one thing I would not rule out is George R. Martin getting the Winds of Winter out and finishing his story on paper, and then them deciding to do the Jon Snow show that features elements from his final books and elements from Game of Thrones. And I know people are going to be like, well, you can't do both. Well, Dr. Sleep disagrees with you. They went out and did a sequel to The Shining and decided, you know what? It's not just going to be a sequel to the movie. It's going to be a sequel to the book too, which are drastically different things at times. And they did an excellent job on it. So I would not rule that possibility out. And the fact there isn't any source material to go off of right now is a massive change from what we've gotten. So I wouldn't be shocked if they're saying, hey, maybe give George some extra time to be more involved in this.
Well, and if they're stalling like that, then maybe it's something that George requested they stall on until he could get something finished. So there's probably a whole lot of behind-the-scenes inner workings that we're just not privy to yet, and we'll just get to watch and experience as they arise. But I think that is going to have to do it for this edition of House of the Empire. Special thanks to Ryan and Sean for being a part of this episode, and thanks to everybody who tuned in and hit subscribe and is subscribing to this channel. There's going to be all kinds of new content on the horizon, as you just heard about. Plenty of things for us to talk about and discuss in the days, weeks, months, and years to come. But for now, we're going to have to sign off, and we will see you all again next time when the Empire returns.
Do you know what legacy means?
It's what you pass down to your children and your children's children. It's what remains of you when you're gone.